December 5th, 1941. 3 a.m. 30 kilometers west of Moscow. General Georgy Zhukov stood in the frozen command post, studying maps covered in red and blue markers. Outside, the temperature had dropped to minus 38 degrees Celsius. His staff officers waited in silence. "Begin the operation," Zhukov said quietly. Within minutes, over 1,000 artillery pieces opened fire along a 900-kilometer front. The sound was unlike anything the German army had experienced in this conflict. This was not defensive fire. This was the opening salvo of a massive counterattack that would shatter German confidence and change the course of the entire Eastern campaign. What happened over the next 6 weeks would become one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. An army that German commanders believed was finished would rise from apparent defeat to deliver the first major setback to forces that had seemed unstoppable. The crisis had been building since June 22, 1941, when 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. Operation Barbarossa had achieved stunning success in its opening months. By October 1941, German forces had captured over 3 million Soviet soldiers, destroyed thousands of tanks and aircraft, and advanced over 1,000 kilometers into Soviet territory. Cities fell with shocking speed. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, believed Moscow would fall before winter. His forces were positioned just kilometers from the Soviet capital. German reconnaissance units could see the Kremlin towers through their binoculars. On October 3, 1941, the Supreme Leader declared to the German people, "The enemy in the east has been struck down and will never rise again." But the leadership and commanders had made catastrophic miscalculations. They underestimated Soviet industrial capacity, the willingness of the population to resist, and most critically, they underestimated what winter would do to an army without proper preparation. By early November, the German advance had stalled. Mud from autumn rains had turned roads into impassable swamps. Supply lines stretched impossibly thin. Then the mud froze, and something worse arrived: the Russian winter. German soldiers discovered their equipment was not designed for extreme cold. Tank engines would not start. Machine guns froze solid. Artillery recoil mechanisms failed. Lieutenant Heinrich Hoppe, a German medical officer, described conditions in his diary. "Frostbite casualties exceed combat casualties by 3 to 1. Men lose fingers, toes, entire feet to the cold. We have no winter clothing, no antifreeze for vehicles. We are freezing while fighting." German casualties from cold-related injuries in November and December exceeded 100,000 men. Entire divisions reported combat effectiveness below 50%. Field Marshal von Bock reported to High Command on November 28th. "The troops have reached the limit of their endurance. Further offensive operations are impossible without rest, reinforcement, and proper winter equipment." But stopping was not in the plan. The directive came back: continue the attack, take Moscow before year's end. On December 1st, German forces made their final attempt to break through to Moscow. Small units penetrated to within 15 kilometers of the Kremlin. They were the closest German forces would ever come. Then the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The offensive collapsed. What German commanders did not know was that while they struggled to maintain positions, the Soviets had been preparing something unprecedented. Throughout October and November, while German forces pushed toward Moscow, the Soviet High Command had been assembling a strategic reserve. Fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East, over 250,000 troops, had been transported west in secret. These were not poorly trained conscripts. These were experienced soldiers, properly equipped for winter combat, with winter uniforms, skis, and equipment designed for extreme cold. General Zhukov had been appointed to command the Western Front in October with a single mission: hold Moscow and prepare for counterattack. Soviet intelligence had also provided crucial information. Agent Richard Sorge in Tokyo confirmed that Japan would not attack Soviet territory in the Far East. This allowed the transfer of 30 divisions from Siberia to the Moscow front. By early December, Zhukov had assembled a force of over 1 million soldiers, 7,600 artillery pieces, 720 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft, all concentrated around Moscow, all waiting for the order to attack. The German High Command had no idea these forces existed. Their intelligence estimated Soviet reserves at perhaps 100,000 men at most. Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group South, had written in late November, "The Red Army is broken. They have no reserves. We need only survive winter, and the campaign will be won in spring." This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. The Soviet counteroffensive began on December 5th, along multiple sectors simultaneously. From Kalinin in the north to Yelets in the south, fresh Soviet divisions crashed into exhausted German positions. The German soldiers had never experienced combat like this. Soviet troops moved on skis, appearing suddenly from forests and snowstorms. They wore white winter camouflage that made them invisible against the snow. They attacked at night in blizzards when German forces huddled around fires trying to stay warm. Soviet T-34 tanks, designed with wide tracks that distributed weight effectively on snow, moved where German vehicles could not. Their diesel engines started in extreme cold, while German gasoline engines failed. Major General Ferdinand Heim, commanding a panzer division, reported on December 7th. "We face fresh enemy forces in winter uniforms. They attack in strength we believed impossible. Our tanks will not start. Our weapons freeze. We cannot hold." The psychological shock was as devastating as the physical attack. For 6 months, German forces had advanced almost continuously. They believed themselves superior in training, equipment, and tactics. Now they faced an enemy who attacked in temperatures that seemed unsurvivable, who moved through terrain Germans found impassable. Lieutenant Joseph Deck described the first Soviet attack. "They came at dawn through a snowstorm. Hundreds of them in white uniforms, appearing like ghosts. Our machine guns jammed from cold. We retreated in chaos, leaving equipment and wounded behind." Within the first week, Soviet forces had penetrated German lines in multiple sectors. The town of Klin was retaken on December 15th. Solnechno-Gorsk fell on December 12th. Kalinin was liberated on December 16th. German commanders struggled to comprehend what was happening. Intelligence reports of Soviet troop strength suddenly multiplied. Divisions that supposedly did not exist were attacking across the entire front. Field Marshal von Bock reported panic. "The enemy attacks with forces we did not know existed. Our troops retreat in disorder. Equipment is abandoned. We face potential catastrophe." The German military leadership faced a crisis unlike any they had encountered. Every previous campaign had ended in rapid victory. France fell in 6 weeks, Poland in 4 weeks. Now, for the first time, German forces were in full retreat. The myth of invincibility was shattering in the frozen forests around Moscow. The Soviet tactics were devastatingly effective. Small mobile groups infiltrated German positions at night. They cut supply routes, attacked command posts, and created chaos in rear areas. Soviet cavalry divisions proved highly effective in winter conditions. Horses could move through deep snow where vehicles could not. Cavalry units penetrated deep behind German lines. Major General Gotthard Heinrici described the tactical nightmare. "The enemy appears everywhere and nowhere. We establish defensive positions, and they infiltrate around us. Our communications fail. Our supplies do not arrive. We are fighting blind in a frozen hell. The temperature continued to drop. By mid-December, readings of -40 degrees were common. German casualties from frostbite exceeded combat casualties. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Thousands of soldiers suffered from frostbite so severe that amputation was necessary. Many died from exposure. Lieutenant Hans Roth wrote on December 18th, "We have lost more men to cold than to Soviet attacks. Soldiers fall asleep and never wake. Others go mad from the freezing temperatures. The cold is a more terrible enemy than any soldier." By December 20th, German forces had been pushed back 100 to 250 kilometers along the entire Moscow front. The carefully organized German positions of early December had dissolved into chaotic retreats. Supply lines collapsed entirely. German units retreated faster than supply columns could follow. Fuel shortages left vehicles abandoned. Ammunition shortages left units defenseless. The German High Command faced an unprecedented decision. Some commanders advocated establishing defensive lines. Others argued for immediate retreat to defensible positions far to the west. The decision came from the supreme leader himself. No retreat. Every position must be held. Any commander who ordered retreat without permission would face severe consequences. This order would save the German army from complete collapse, but at a terrible cost. The no-retreat order forced German units to hold positions that were tactically indefensible. Villages became fortresses. Small towns became focal points for desperate battles. The battle for Mojaisk demonstrated the new dynamic. German forces held the town despite being surrounded on three sides. After 2 weeks of fighting, the defending division had been reduced from 12,000 men to fewer than 3,000 combat-effective soldiers. Similar battles erupted across the front. German units held villages with dwindling supplies and mounting casualties. Soviet forces pressed attacks, taking heavy losses, but forcing Germans to expend irreplaceable resources. The Soviet casualties were staggering. In the first month of the counteroffensive, Soviet forces suffered over 370,000 casualties, including 139,000 lost permanently. Tank losses exceeded 400 vehicles. But the Soviets could replace these losses. Soviet industry produced thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces monthly. Training camps graduated tens of thousands of new soldiers. Germany could not match this production. Every soldier lost outside Moscow was irreplaceable. Every tank destroyed would not be replaced until spring at earliest. Lieutenant General Heinz Guderian recognized the crisis. In a report on December 20th, he wrote, "We face an enemy with apparently unlimited reserves while our forces diminish daily. We cannot win an attrition battle against an enemy who can replace losses while we cannot." His assessment was ignored. The orders remained. Hold all positions. No retreat. By Christmas 1941, the human suffering on both sides had reached almost incomprehensible levels. German soldiers froze in inadequate bunkers. Soviet soldiers advanced through snow and ice, attacking fortified positions, suffering terrible casualties. The city of Moscow itself, while never directly threatened after early December, endured air raids and shortages. Yet Moscow never fell. The Soviet government remained. Factories continued production. Life continued under siege conditions, but without surrender. This psychological victory was as important as the military success. The Soviet population saw that their army could fight back, that German forces could be defeated. For German forces, the psychological impact was devastating. The entire strategic concept had been based on rapid victory before winter. That plan had failed completely. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, wrote on December 28th, "The illusion that we could end this campaign rapidly has been destroyed. We face extended conflict against an enemy with greater resources. The strategic situation has fundamentally changed." By early January 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive had achieved remarkable results. German forces had been pushed back between 100 and 250 kilometers. The immediate threat to Moscow had been eliminated. German casualties exceeded 400,000 men. But the Soviet offensive was reaching its own limits. Advancing units had outrun supply lines. Casualties had been heavy. Zhukov wanted to continue the offensive. Other commanders urged consolidation. The decision came from Stalin. The offensive would continue. German forces must be destroyed before they could recover. This decision would lead to further Soviet advances, but also to heavy casualties that would set the stage for renewed German offensives in 1942. The counteroffensive at Moscow did not end the conflict. 2 more years of terrible fighting lay ahead, but it achieved something equally important. It proved that German forces could be defeated. It destroyed the myth of invincibility. It gave hope that victory was possible. By February 1942, the Soviet winter offensive had finally exhausted itself. Soviet forces had advanced between 150 and 400 kilometers in different sectors, liberating thousands of square kilometers and hundreds of towns. But the cost had been immense. Soviet casualties from December through March exceeded 1 million men. Tank losses approached 2,000 vehicles. Aircraft losses exceeded 1,000 planes. German forces, having survived the initial shock, now held a defensive line that remained intact. Army Group Center had not been destroyed, though badly damaged. The strategic situation had fundamentally changed. German forces would remain on Soviet territory for 2 more years. They would launch new offensives in 1942 and 1943. But they would never again threaten Moscow. They would never again believe that rapid victory was achievable. They would never again underestimate Soviet military capacity. For the Soviet military and population, the Moscow counteroffensive became a turning point. It proved that resistance was not futile. It demonstrated that German forces could be beaten. This psychological victory would sustain the Soviet war effort through terrible defeats in 1942, through Stalingrad, through the massive tank battles of 1943, all the way to final victory in 1945. The lessons learned outside Moscow shaped Soviet military doctrine for the remainder of the conflict. The importance of reserves, the value of winter operations, the effectiveness of mobile warfare became central to Soviet thinking. For German commanders, the Moscow counteroffensive exposed fatal flaws in their strategic planning. The belief that Soviet industry could not sustain prolonged conflict proved wrong. The assumption that Soviet forces would collapse proved catastrophically incorrect. Most importantly, the complete failure to prepare for winter operations demonstrated a level of overconfidence that bordered on delusion. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel later admitted, "We believed our own propaganda. We thought the enemy would collapse quickly. The failure to provide winter clothing was criminal negligence that cost hundreds of thousands of casualties." The strategic impact extended beyond the immediate military situation. The failure to capture Moscow in 1941 meant the entire timeline of the Eastern Campaign was disrupted. German strategic planning had assumed Moscow would fall before winter. Instead, German forces entered 1942 weakened, facing an enemy that had demonstrated capacity for large-scale counteroffensives. The Japanese decision not to attack Soviet territory allowed transfer of Siberian divisions to Moscow. This meant Soviet forces could concentrate against Germany without dividing resources, a massive strategic advantage. For the Soviet Union, the successful defense of Moscow provided crucial time to reorganize industry, train new forces, and develop weapons and tactics that would eventually lead to victory. The T-34 tank would be produced in tens of thousands. The Katyusha rocket artillery would become a standard weapon. The tactics learned in winter battles would be refined and used in later campaigns. The human cost was staggering. Soviet casualties from October 1941 through March 1942 exceeded 1.8 million men. German casualties exceeded 600,000 men. These figures represent individual tragedies multiplied beyond comprehension. The frozen forests around Moscow became graveyards for a generation. Yet from this terrible cost came a transformation in the strategic situation that would ultimately shape the outcome of the entire conflict in Europe. The Moscow counteroffensive stands as one of the most significant military operations of the entire global conflict. It was not the largest battle nor the most decisive in terms of territory captured, but it was the first major defeat of German forces. It was the first large-scale counteroffensive that pushed German forces back significantly. For military historians, the Moscow counteroffensive provides case studies in multiple aspects of warfare: the importance of intelligence and deception, the value of operational reserves, the impact of logistics on military operations. Soviet operational security in concealing the buildup of reserves demonstrated sophisticated intelligence work. German forces had no indication that over 250,000 fresh troops had been positioned around Moscow. The timing of the offensive, launched precisely when German forces were at their weakest, showed operational planning that exploited enemy vulnerabilities ruthlessly. The use of forces specifically trained and equipped for winter operations against an unprepared enemy demonstrated the importance of adaptation to environmental factors. These lessons would be studied in military academies worldwide for decades. The principle that environmental conditions can be as important as numbers or technology became accepted doctrine. For the Soviet military, the Moscow counteroffensive validated tactical and operational concepts that would shape doctrine through the remainder of the conflict. The concept of deep operations using mechanized and cavalry forces to penetrate enemy rear areas proved effective. The value of maintaining strategic reserves was demonstrated. The effectiveness of combined arms operations became standard Soviet practice. For German military planning, the Moscow counteroffensive forced a complete reassessment of strategic assumptions. The belief in rapid victory had to be abandoned. The psychological impact on German military leadership was profound. Confidence in inevitable victory was shattered. Officers who had believed they were commanding an invincible force now understood they faced an enemy capable of defeating them. For the Soviet population, the successful defense of Moscow provided hope when the situation had seemed desperate. Soviet information services emphasized the victories, the German retreats. This psychological boost to civilian morale was crucial. Soviet industry required millions of workers. The population needed to believe their sacrifices had purpose. The Moscow counteroffensive provided that belief. It demonstrated German forces could be beaten, that victory was possible even after terrible defeats. The broader strategic impact extended beyond the Eastern Front. The evidence that German forces were not invincible encouraged resistance movements across Europe. It influenced strategic planning by other nations. It affected diplomatic calculations, showing that the Soviet Union would remain a significant military power. What is undeniable is that German commanders were genuinely shocked by the Soviet winter counterattack. Their assumptions had been wrong. Their intelligence had failed. Their preparations had been inadequate. In the frozen forests around Moscow in December 1941, the myth of German invincibility died. The belief in rapid victory disappeared. General Heinz Guderian reflected years later. We had been told the enemy was beaten. We believed victory was certain. Then fresh enemy forces attacked in strength we thought impossible. We realized we had underestimated everything. That realization changed everything. The sign of German invincibility came down in December 1941. It would never go back up. The Eastern Front would continue for 3.5 more years. But the psychological transformation that occurred in winter 1941 shaped all that followed. One Soviet counteroffensive, launched at the moment of maximum German weakness, demonstrated that the outcome was not predetermined, that German forces could be defeated, that victory was possible. History would judge the Moscow counteroffensive as a crucial turning point, not because it ended the conflict, but because it proved the conflict could be won.